Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. 1 minute. I apologize. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who's not a volume and is not in a place. And how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He created everything except himself, including you and your actions. Nothing occurs except by his will, both good and bad, he destined to happen. He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light, he's not a spirit, he has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled master, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And may Allah increase us in patience, humility, knowledge, and comprehension, and help us to put our knowledge into practice, and grant us all sincere intentions. Ameen. We're continuing in the book, The Straight Path, As-Sirat al-Mustaqim, written by the Shaykh Abdullah al-Harari. May Allah have mercy on him. Ameen. For those of you who need a copy of the book, there's a link in the comments. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah to those who salamed me. Let's continue in the book. We're going to pick up on page 202. Page 202. The paragraph at the bottom of the page of 202. We're discussing today the concept of acquiring deeds. This isn't the first time we've mentioned it, but today we're going to talk about it in perhaps slightly more detail than what we talked about it in before. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, said, the special thing about the voluntary deeds, meaning those deeds to which we have an inclination, is that they are acquired by us. Okay, so what we mentioned in the paragraph right before this is that all of our actions are created by Allah. Whether those actions are voluntary or involuntary, they're created by Allah. And one of the dalils we mentioned is the ayah in Surah Al-An'am, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. In this ayah, Allah commands us to say, my salat and my nusuk and my life and my death are owned by Allah. Okay, these things belong to Allah. Allah is the one that created these things. And what are the four things in the list? My salat and my nusuk. Nusuk is like pilgrimage and things pertaining to pilgrimage. So salat nusuk, these are things that I do voluntarily. And here the ayah says that Allah is the owner of them, meaning Allah is the creator of them. But then it mentions my life and my death, also among the things that Allah is the creator of. And I don't voluntarily choose when I'm going to live and when I'm going to die. So this ayah is proof that the actions that we choose to do are created by Allah, and the actions that we do not choose to do are also created by Allah. So what's the difference? Our voluntary and involuntary actions are all created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then what makes the voluntary deed special? It says in the first sentence, bottom of page 202, it says the special thing about the voluntary deeds, meaning those to which we have an inclination, meaning the deeds that we choose to do, the things that we directed our will towards doing. The special thing about them is that they are acquired by us. Okay, so the voluntary deeds are created by Allah, and the involuntary deeds are created by Allah. So there's no difference in that respect. The difference between them is that our voluntary deeds are acquired by us, but our involuntary deeds are not acquired by us. What do we mean when we say a deed was acquired? We mean that we're going to be held accountable for that deed on the day of judgment. Okay, you can think of something being acquired as like a deed being written down in your book of the deeds that you're going to be judged on the day of judgment. You acquired the deed. So the only deeds that we acquire are the deeds that we chose to do. Let's keep reading. It says the special thing about the voluntary deeds, meaning those deeds to which we have an inclination, is that they are acquired by us. Therefore, meaning because they're acquired by us, or rather because we chose to do them, we have an inclination towards them, because we directed our will towards doing them. It says, therefore, they are the subject of accountability. Right? Because we chose to do those things, this is why we're held accountable for them. It doesn't matter that Allah is the one who created our action. Okay, why do we get judged on our actions? Because we chose those actions. That's why we're only judged on the actions that we chose to do. We don't get judged for the actions we didn't choose. Okay, if one of us starts talking in our sleep, we're not going to get judged for whatever we said while we're sleeping because we didn't choose to say those things. You understand? If one of us goes insane, he loses his mind, and he walks around doing all kind of crazy things, he's not going to be held accountable for those things because he's not choosing what to do. You understand? It's the choice that makes us accountable for the deed, the fact that we chose to do it. That's what it means here when it says, therefore, they are the subject of accountability. Our voluntary deeds are the ones we're accountable for because we chose to do them. It says, acquisition, which is the deed of the slave, for which he is either rewarded or punished in the hereafter, is. So we're going to define what we mean by acquiring a deed. It says it is the slave's directing his intention and will towards a deed. He exerts his power in that. Then Allah creates it for him upon that. So the slave is an acquirer of his deed, and Allah, the Exalted, is the creator of the deed of the slave, which is his acquisition. All right, that's a little bit complicated. It's saying that when you or I perform some action, we are slaves of Allah. In books like this, when it says the slave, it just means the created thing. In this case, the human. Okay, the human being. If the human being does an action, okay, say he gives some money to a needy person. Okay, when the slave does an action, who is the one that created that action? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created that action. Who is the one who performed that action? The slave is the one who performed that action, but only because Allah created the movement in the slave's body. Okay, so the slave does not have the ability to create movement even in his own body. Allah created the movement in the slave's body. And because Allah created that movement, the slave was able to perform that deed. Okay? But up until this point, the fact that Allah created movement in the person's body and the fact that the body actually, performed a deed, up until that point alone, we don't know if the slave acquired the action. Because we need to know, did the slave choose to do the action? So if the slave directed his intention and his will towards doing that action, and on top of that, Allah created the action for him, well, then that is a case of the slave acquiring the action. So in order to acquire an action, the slave, there are two things that have to happen in order for the slave to acquire an action. The first thing is that the slave must direct his will towards that action. Because if he didn't choose to do the action, he doesn't acquire the deed. So in order to acquire the deed, it must be the case that the slave chose that action. He directed his will towards doing it. And the second thing that must be true in order for the slave to acquire a deed is that he has to actually do the action. Meaning Allah created that movement in the slave such that the slave performed the action. Okay, so if both things occur, if the slave directed his will towards doing the act and Allah created that act for him, if both of those things happen, we say the slave has acquired his act. Now, if it's a good act, he'll be rewarded for it, insha'Allah. And if it's a bad act, then he deserves punishment for it. Okay, but this is what we mean when we say to create. This is what we mean when we say to acquire an action. We mean how many things happening? The slave directing his will towards it, and then Allah creating it. Okay, this is what's meant by acquiring a deed. It's important for us to understand that acquisition is something that's less than creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only creator. He's the only thing with the power to create. The slaves, you and I, we cannot create anything. Okay? But what the slave can do is acquire actions. Okay, the slave cannot create movement in his body or stillness for that matter. The slave cannot create his actions. But because the slave has a will, he can choose actions. And if Allah creates the action, that's how he acquires it. So acquiring the deed does not involve creating the deed. It's something less than that. Okay? And this is, an important thing to grasp for us to understand the reality of the test that we're living. Okay? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created paradise and he created hell. He created people for paradise and he created people for hell. This life that we're living right now, this is a life in which we are being tested. And the choices that we make will demonstrate whether we are one of the people of paradise or whether we are one of the people of hell. This is what we must understand about acquiring deeds. Because when the slave makes a choice, when he directs his will towards doing a certain action, Allah creates that action for him for what purpose? Why does Allah create the action that the slave wills to do? Because in creating that action, Allah is making apparent, he's revealing to the world, he's exposing what Allah knew about that slave. You see, Allah knew in eternity that that slave was going to will that action. Allah knew in eternity that that slave was going to do that deed. And it's not possible for the knowledge of Allah to change. And it's not possible for the knowledge of Allah to be wrong. So the only thing that could possibly happen is that that slave would actually perform the action that Allah knew in eternity that slave would choose. So when we direct our wills towards doing something, Allah creates the action as a means of revealing, making public, making apparent the choices that we're making. And it'll be clear to everybody what kind of person we are. The person who makes bad choices ends up doing bad deeds, and then on the day of judgment, he's held accountable for those deeds. The person who makes good choices does good deeds, and on the day of judgment, he's rewarded for those good deeds. This is the test that we're on right now. Okay, by means of this life that we're in right now, Allah is revealing the hearts of the slaves. Some of the slaves have hearts that are full of light, and it's obvious in the deeds that they do that their hearts are full of light. Some of the slaves have hearts that are full of darkness, and it's obvious in the deeds that they choose to do that their hearts are full of darkness. Okay, by creating the deeds that we will to do, Allah is revealing, making apparent, exposing to everyone else what kind of heart we have. MashaAllah. The author, we're on the top of page 203. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, said, "This is among the most obscure matters in this science." So in the science of Aqidah, which we are studying, in this particular Islamic science, in this particular field of knowledge, this matter right now that we're discussing right now, it's one of the most subtle, most difficult to grasp, most easy to miss aspects of Aqidah. The distinction between acquiring deeds and creating deeds. And you'll see that this is something that some of the astray groups have really gotten confused about, because this thing is not easy to understand. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, he mentions an ayah. It's the last ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah. He says, Allah the Exalted said, "Laha ma kasabat wa alayha maktasabat." This ayah, "Laha ma kasabat wa alayha maktasabat," it says, which means for every soul is what it acquired of good, and against it is what it acquired of bad. In this ayah, it uses two different words for acquire. It uses the word kasabat, and it uses the word iktasabat. Okay, kasabat refers to the acquiring of good things. Iktasabat refers to the acquiring of bad things. Okay, so it says laha ma kasabat, meaning in its favor are the deeds that it acquired, meaning the good ones. Wa alayha, meaning against it, are what it acquired, meaning the bad deeds that it acquired. Okay, in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it very clear. He explicitly states that what the slave does is acquire actions. Okay, the slave acquires them. The slave does not create them, the slave acquires them. Continuing in the book, it says, "Therefore, the human is not compelled because compulsion negates accountability." Why are we emphasizing this issue of acquiring deeds so much? So that we don't fall into the trap of the Jabriya. Okay, the Jabriya were an astray group who believe that humans don't have a choice, that humans don't have a will. We're saying here the human is not compelled. By compelled here, it means without a will. It says the human is not compelled because compulsion negates accountability. If it were true that the human did not have any choice at all, then it would be the case that the human could not be held accountable because he didn't do anything. Okay? It says, this is the true way. Okay? The Arabic here, it's translated as this is the true way, but I would have translated it as this is the madhab of truth. Okay, the madhab of truth, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, this is what we say. We say the human is not compelled. Okay, it's not the case that the human's without a will, because if the human did not have a will, then he would not be accountable. This is the madhab of truth. And it is different from the belief in compulsion, which is the astray sect called the Jabriya, and in denying destiny. That is the schools of the Jabriya and the Qadariya. So in this paragraph, the author is saying Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is a middle path between two opposite extremes. On the one hand, you have the extreme of the Jabriya, the ones who believe in compulsion, the ones who believe that the slave does not have a will, the ones who believe that the humans are like a feather in the wind. When the wind blows this way, the feather goes that way. When the wind blows that way, the feather goes that way. And the feather has no say whatsoever in anything that happens to it. The Jabriya believe the humans are like that. The Jabriya believe that Allah willed everything that will happen, and so the humans have no say. What Allah willed to be, the will of Allah just kind of forces the person that way, and the person doesn't have a will at all. This is what the Jabriya say. This is an extreme view, and it's kufr. It's blasphemy. And at the other extreme, we have the extreme of the Qadariya, the ones who deny destiny. Okay, the ones who deny destiny, what do they say? They say that they say that the slave creates his deeds. So you see that these two groups are like really, really, really far away from one another. Very far. The Jabriya, the ones who believe in compulsion, they basically believe that the slave doesn't even have deeds, because he didn't create the deeds, and according to them, he didn't even choose the deeds. So there's nothing to be judged on. The Mu'tazila, they say that the slave not only has a will by which he chooses his deeds, the Qadariya, they say that the slave created those deeds as well. So the Jabriya say they negate will and negate creation from the slaves. They negate both. The Mu'tazila affirm both. They affirm that the slave has a will and that the slave creates. These are opposite extremes, and they're both blasphemy. The madhab of truth, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, is the middle path. We affirm that the slave has a will, and we deny that the slave creates. Okay, we affirm that creation is something that's only for Allah, and what the slave is able to do is merely acquire his deeds, and he acquires those deeds because he directed his will towards them, and Allah created those deeds for him to expose him. And so he'll be judged upon those deeds which the slave himself chose to do. This is the madhab of truth. To put it in another way, the Sunnis, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we say that the slave has a will, he has a choice, but his choice is mixed with compulsion. He has a choice that's mixed with compulsion. Or to put it another way, we say that the slave has a will, that follows the will of Allah. So the slave has a will, but that will is not independent. He will never will something different than what Allah willed. To put it another way, we say that the slave has a will, but that will is under the will of Allah. Okay, so it's important that we affirm that the human has a will, but we also affirm that his will is not independent. This is why I always refuse to use the expression free will. On the internet and things, when people debate and people ask questions, they always like to throw around this term, free will, free will, free will, free will. I've never heard a Muslim scholar describe the will of the human being as being free. Okay? What the Islamic scholars say is that the human has a will. We affirm that there's a will, and we can point to the ayah of the Quran, وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ, to point out that here Allah explicitly mentions that the slaves have a will, explicitly mentions that he has a will, and explicitly mentions that the wills of the slave do not disagree with the will of Allah. This is a concise statement of what we, the Sunnis, believe, mashallah. So if people try to get you to use this expression free will, challenge it. Say to them, the humans have a will. Say, I don't know anything about this word free. The term free will is not something that is mentioned, as far as I know, in the discourse of the Muslims. This is an expression that comes from European history, from the philosophical and theological discourses that the Christians used to have. As for us, we don't have problems believing in destiny. We know that Allah knows everything, and the knowledge of Allah cannot be wrong. So therefore, the future must play out exactly the way Allah knew it would play out. Okay, every choice that we have yet to make, Allah already knows what those choices are going to be. They're already written down on the guarded tablet. But none of that negates the fact that when it's time to make the choice, we do make a choice. Okay, so the humans have a choice. Okay, and it's obvious, like our own experience is enough to demonstrate that we have a choice. Okay, if I stand up from my chair, I chose to do that. None of us ever feel like our body is being moved by some outside force against our will. When we move, we choose to move. Okay, so the fact that we have a will, the fact that we have a choice, is something we all intrinsically know and understand. Okay, but having a choice of our own does not negate the fact that destiny is real. These are two things that can coexist and both be true. And the way to understand it is to know that the will of the slave is not independent of the will of Allah. Let's keep reading. It says, whoever says that the slave creates his own deeds, like the Mu'tazila, blasphemes. So the Qadariyya, the people who deny destiny, were many groups. There were many different subgroups under the heading of Qadariyya, and several of those subgroups fall under another subheading of Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila were a big fitna early on. And what the author here is saying is that if anyone believes, as the Mu'tazila did, that the slave creates his own actions, that person is a kafir. It says, as Ibn Abbas said, may Allah accept his deeds, the talk of the Qadariyya is blasphemy. So Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiyallahu anhuma, okay, one of the top scholars of the Sahaba, a man who in his time was considered the top scholar in the world. What did he say about the Mu'tazila? He said, the talk of the Mu'tazila, meaning the things that they say, is kufr. Okay, it's blasphemy. It takes one out of Islam. It says, and the Qadariya are the Mu'tazila. The Qadariya are the Mu'tazila. Okay, why is it kufr to say that the slave creates his own deeds? Because it goes against many ayahs that say that Allah creates everything, such as the ayah, قُلِ اللَّهُ خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, which means say, Allah is the creator of everything. Okay, or like the ayah, وَخَلَقَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, which means Allah created everything. Or like the ayah, هَلْ مِنْ خَالِقٍ غَيْرُ اللَّهِ, is there a creator other than Allah? Which is a rhetorical way of saying that there is no creator other than Allah. Or like the ayah, إِنَّا كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقْنَاهُ بِقَدَرٍ, the ayah in which Allah says that He created everything and destined it. These are very clear ayahs in the Quran. So the one who says that the slave creates, that person is rejecting all of these ayahs. This is why it's kufr. Okay? Now, some of these Mu'tazila, or most of the Mu'tazila, they said that Allah created the bodies only. They said that Allah creates the body of the slave, but the slave creates his own actions. Some of them, they added like a little restriction to it. They said the slave creates his voluntary actions, but not the involuntary ones. But one of the main issues that the Mu'tazila fell under was saying that the slave creates his own deeds. Some of them tried to hide. They would add a statement, hoping that that statement would kind of like protect them from being obviously recognized as deviant. They used to say the slave creates his own deeds with the power that Allah created in them. They add that part. They say with the power that Allah created in them. And they hope that by adding that, they're trying to use transitive property or something to try to make it seem like Allah is still the creator of those actions. But it's because Allah gave the slave power to create, and then the slave created the action. I don't know what kind of reasoning they're trying to use, but some of them tried to say that to try to make it seem less obvious that they're astray. Okay. And some of the later Mu'tazila even went so far as to say that Allah was able to create the movements and stillnesses of the slaves before He gave that power to the slaves. But after giving that power to the slave, he became impotent to control that. He became unable to create movement and stillness in the slaves. Some of them even went so far as to say that, subhanallah. Okay, this is obvious kufr. And this is why Ibn Abbas said that the speech of the Qadariya is kufr, because the Qadariya were saying that the humans can create. MashaAllah. Would be more precise, actually, no. In Ibn Abbas's time, the Qadariya were saying that there are things that happen that weren't willed by Allah. And that's what Ibn Abbas said. That's why Ibn Abbas said that their speech is blasphemy. But in time, they got more and more extreme. And eventually began saying that slaves create their deeds. And eventually later started saying that Allah is powerless over certain things. May Allah protect us. Ameen. Anyway, so you have Ibn Abbas. We're on the top of page 204. We have Ibn Abbas explicitly saying that the Qadariya are blasphemers. They're kafirs. And then it says, Abu Yusuf said, Abu Yusuf that we're talking about here is Abu Yusuf al-Qadi. the famous companion of Abu Hanifa. Okay, it says, Abu Yusuf said, the Mu'tazila are not people of religion. The Arabic word he used was zanadiqa. He said the Qadariya are zanadiqa, which literally means atheists. Like, they're people who don't believe, they don't have a religion. Abu Yusuf referred to the Qadariya or the Mu'tazila. He said they are zanadiqa, means they don't have a religion. Okay, what he means by that is that they are like atheists. Means they are like atheists. Why would he say that? Because when they say that the humans create their own actions, it's as if they're denying that there's a creator at all. Okay? It's as if they're denying that there's a creator in the first place. MashaAllah. And I should mention here, because this is something that you might hear. I know I see it sometimes when I read books, and you'll see this on the internet when like the people try to cause fitna and stuff. And you'll especially see this if you go to a Western university and you take like a religion class at a Western university. What will they do? They will claim that some of the caliphs were Mu'tazilites. And they will claim that this is proof that the Mu'tazila are not kafirs. But these are distortions of the truth. The fact of the matter is the three caliphs that they're referring to, Mu'tasim, his brother Al-Ma'mun, and Al-Ma'mun's son Al-Wathiq, these three caliphs during the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, they agreed with the Mu'tazila in one matter and disagreed with them in everything else. Okay, those three caliphs, what did they agree with the Mu'tazila on? The Mu'tazila, one of the things they used to say, they used to go around saying the Quran is created. This was like their like anthem. It was like their saying. It was their flag is to say the Quran is created. So they used to go around saying that. And those three caliphs agreed with the Mu'tazila in this sentence. And because the caliphs had a lot of power, they were able to torture and punish a lot of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah who used to refuse to say that the Quran is created. Because they were going around torturing some of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah, and because they used to say the Quran is created, some people interpreted that as meaning that those three caliphs were Mu'tazilites. But in reality, they did not agree with the Mu'tazilites in anything other than that one sentence. And if they did, the scholars would have referred to the caliphs as kafirs, and then it would have been an obligation upon the people to rebel against them. Because we tolerate sinful leaders, we do not tolerate kafir leaders. A kafir cannot be the Khalifa. And the Muslim scholars did not declare those three caliphs to not be caliphs. Okay, so we know they did not cross the line into blasphemy. Rather, they simply used to say the Quran is created. And from earlier lessons, the details around that. All right, the sentence, the Quran is created, it's something we don't say, not by itself, but one of the main reasons why we don't say it is because it's the saying of the Mu'tazila. And by saying it, you're supporting the madhab of a deviant group. Right? The other reason why we don't say it is because the word Quran is sometimes used to refer to Allah's eternal attribute. And sometimes it's used to refer to the revelation given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are two completely different usages of the word Al-Quran. One of these things is not created. That would be Allah's attribute. Okay, Allah's eternal attribute of speech, which is called the Quran, is not created. But the revelation that was given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the sounds and the letters, those things are created. But despite the fact that the sounds and letters, the expressions, despite the fact that the expressions in the revealed text are created expressions, that doesn't change the fact that what is being expressed is something that is uncreated, something that is eternal. This is why we don't say the Quran is created. We don't just say it like that, because it's the statement of an astray group, and because it can be misunderstood as someone claiming that Allah is attributed with a created attribute, which is kufr. And also because even when you're referring to the revealed text, it's only the expressions that are created, not what's being expressed in the revealed text. Okay, so therefore it's not really acceptable to say this, which is why the scholars of Ahl Sunnah at the time, they used to refuse to say it. Okay, but it's not technically wrong for a person to say the Quran is created if what they mean is the sounds and the letters. The sounds and the letters of the revealed text. If the person just means the sounds and the letters are created, or he just means the ink and the paper are created, well, then those things are obviously true. Okay, that's obviously true. But it doesn't mean that what those sounds and letters are expressing is something created. It does not mean that. Okay, and for sure, the attribute that Allah is attributed with is something that's eternal. It's beginningless, endless, and changeless. Okay, so when those three caliphs started saying the Quran is created, what they meant was the sounds and the letters. Okay, they actually did not agree with the Mu'tazila about what the Mu'tazila meant when the Mu'tazila used to say the Quran is created. When the Mu'tazila said the Quran is created, what did they mean by it? They were denying that Allah has an attribute of speech at all. The Mu'tazila, they denied that, the Mu'tazila denied, how do I say this? The Mu'tazila denied that Allah has attributes. The Mu'tazila said Allah does not have any attributes. Not an attribute of speech, not an attribute of knowledge, not an attribute of will, not any attributes at all. And that is why the Mu'tazila used to go around saying the Quran is created. Because they were saying Allah has no speech other than the created sounds and letters. And this is not what Ahl Sunnah says. Ahl Sunnah says Allah is attributed with an attribute of speech, which is eternal. It has no beginning. It has no end. It does not change. It has no similarity to any created thing. It is not sounds. It is not letters. It does not come in spurts. Okay? What Allah revealed to his Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sounds and it was letters. It was Arabic language and it had grammar. It was similar to created speech. Okay? These are two completely different things. But it doesn't change the fact that those created expressions, those Arabic expressions, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, those expressions are created, but what those expressions are expressing is something that's not created, if you understand. Anyway, point is, those three caliphs, they did not agree with the Mu'tazila really in anything. What they did is they agreed with the Mu'tazila in one sentence. Okay? And they did not mean by that sentence what the Mu'tazila meant when they said that sentence, which is why even in that one sentence, they didn't really agree. But the commonality between the three caliphs and the Mu'tazila is that the Mu'tazila used to say that sentence and the caliphs used to say that sentence, even though they meant different things by it. MashaAllah. This is a long story, but you all should know this. Because especially if any of you are in college, this is the colleges these days, they're like in love with the Mu'tazila. They're in love with the Mu'tazila. And they're spreading a lot of Mu'tazila stuff. And the only reason for them to do that is if they have like an active like campaign against Islam. Let's keep reading. So he said, Ibn Abbas said the Mu'tazila are kafirs. Abu Yusuf, the judge, said the Mu'tazila are kafirs. Then it says also, Abu Mansur at-Tamimi, in his book, Al-Farqu Bayn al-Firaq, described them as mushriks. Abu Mansur is about whom Ibn Hajar al-Haytami referred to using this expression, the great Imam, the Imam of our colleagues, Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi said. And he is among those from whom al-Bayhaqi copied hadith. So this scholar, Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, also known as Abdul Qahir at-Tamimi, this man is one of the hugest scholars in our Islamic history. He was a Shafi'i scholar, and in the Shafi'i school, he is a huge imam. As Ibn Hajar here said, the great imam, the imam of our colleagues. What does he mean when he says the imam of our colleagues? He's saying because Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi was a huge scholar of the Shafi'i school and of the Ash'ari school. And it's common among people who are both Shafi'i and Ash'ari to use the phrase ashabuna, like our colleagues. If someone says, ashabuna say whatever, or he's the imam of ashabina, what they mean by that is this person is both Ash'ari and Shafi'i. And so Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, who is a well-known Shafi'i scholar, said about Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, like describing him, said he's the great imam, the imam of our colleagues, Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, just so you understand who we're talking about. So these are three of the top scholars in our Islamic history that we have mentioned here. Ibn Abbas among the Sahaba, Abu Yusuf among the people of the second Islamic century. Okay. And Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, who is of the third or possibly early fourth Islamic century. These are the very huge scholars, mashallah, all of whom said that the Mu'tazila are what? Blasphemers, kafirs. It says, do not be enticed by some of the latter day figures lacking or lack of charging them with blasphemy. So what it's saying here is, look, don't be deceived or confused by the fact that some, not even that many, but some of the like late people who lived in like the last 300 or 400 years, some of the late scholars refused to say that the Mu'tazila are kafirs. He's saying here, don't be deceived by that. These late people who refuse to call the Mu'tazila kafirs, they don't have nearly the level of knowledge that the early scholars had. Nor do they have nearly the understanding, the depth of understanding of the things the Mu'tazila actually taught and said. By the time those late scholars came around, the Mu'tazila had been stamped out. They didn't even deal with them. Those early scholars were the ones debating them. The early scholars were the ones who actually had to defeat the Mu'tazila, which took centuries, by the way. Okay, they knew very well exactly what the Mu'tazila taught. This man, Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, in his book, Al-Farqu Bayn al-Firaq, he lays out 20 different sects of the Qadariyah and lays out the differences among them and how this one said this and that one said that and how the groups are not the same and they have different sayings, etc., etc., etc. He knew in great detail exactly what the Mu'tazila say, and he said very clearly they are kafirs. So don't let somebody of less knowledge, of less experience, don't let the fact that that lesser scholar disagreed somehow confuse you. Okay, stick with what the people who really knew and really understood said. That's why it says here, Ustadh. So Abu Mansur al-Tamimi, they also used to call him the Ustadh, which back in those days was very high praise. Okay, it's basically like saying the professor. Okay, in those days, if you were a top scholar, they might call you a sheikh. Like a big, big scholar, they might call you a sheikh in those days, or an alim. If someone called you the ustad, it meant you're like higher than that. Okay, Ustad Abu Mansur Tamimi conveyed the imams. Okay, this is plural. Look where the apostrophe is. It comes after the S. Okay. It says Abu Mansur Tamimi conveyed the imams' charge of blasphemy against them in his book Usul al-Din, and likewise in his book Tafsir al-Asma'i was-Sifat. So Abu Mansur Tamimi, Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, Abdul Qahir al-Tamimi, whatever you want to call him, in his book Usul al-Din, he mentioned that the imams before him, we're talking the big imams, like Imam al-Shafi'i himself, like Imam al-Ash'ari himself, the imams, he conveyed that the imams all charged the Mu'tazila as being kafirs. He said that in his book Usul al-Din, and he said it in his book Tafsir al-Asma'i was-Sifat. Continuing, it says, he said in his book Tafsir al-Asma'i was-Sifat, our colleagues have a consensus, meaning ijma', about charging the Mu'tazila with blasphemy, meaning those who say the slave creates his voluntary deeds, and likewise those who say that it is obligatory on Allah to do what is most suitable for the slave. Okay, so Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, he said, our colleagues, our ashab, meaning the ones who are Shafi'is and Ash'aris, says they have a consensus. He's saying in his time, all of the Shafi'i scholars who are Ash'ari scholars, they all unanimously agreed that the Mu'tazila are kafirs. Specifically, the ones who held one of these two beliefs. The ones who say the slave creates his voluntary deeds, and also the ones who say that Allah is obligated to do whatever is most suitable for the slaves, which is another saying that many of the Mu'tazila used to say. He means by his saying our colleagues, the Ash'aris and the Shafi'is, because he is an Ash'ari and a Shafi'i. In fact, he is a prominent leader among the Shafi'is, according to Ibn Hajar. He is also a forerunning imam in transmission. Okay, meaning he's like early. He's like one of the big imams of the early days when it comes to transmitting things in the madhab. It says he's also a forerunning imam in transmission, known for that among the scholars of fiqh, the scholars of usul. By usul here it means aqidah, and the historians who have authored works about the factions. Okay, the factions meaning the deviant groups, the different sects that claim to be Muslim. So he's saying in these three areas, he is basically like the marja'. Like if you want to study Shafi'i fiqh, if you want to study aqidah, if you want to study the history of the deviant groups, you basically have to go to him. Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, like he's one of the main people that this knowledge comes through. He's one of the big, big imams. He says, so whoever wants more certainty, let him read these books of his. All right, the author, may Allah have mercy on him, he's mentioning all of this because he knows that this paragraph is a little bit like controversial. Okay, there are people nowadays who are shy to call a kafir a kafir. Okay, we should never be shy to call a kafir a kafir. We should be shy to call a Muslim a kafir. Don't do that. But if the person's a kafir, don't be shy to call him a kafir. If a Jewish person walks in here and I know he's Jewish, what, I'm supposed to be shy to say, man, he a kafir? No, he's clearly a kafir. If a Christian walks in here, I know he's a kafir. He's clearly a kafir. If someone walks in here believing Allah is in a place or in a direction, or that Allah goes up and down, well, I know he's a kafir. That's not something I need to be shy about. Okay? But for some reason, there are some people nowadays, they're very shy to call someone a kafir, even when it's obvious. And so if they hear stuff like we're covering today, if they hear someone teaching that the Mu'tazila were kafirs, they feel uneasy. They don't want to say it. They want to disagree with it. They want to be nice because they think being nice and gentle and not taking a stance on anything, they think that's the best way to do things. That's why he's taking the time to say, well, that's not how the scholars of the past did it. That's why he's saying Ibn Abbas called them kafirs. Abu Yusuf called them kafirs. Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi called them kafirs. And these are just 3 examples. There are many others who called them kafirs and who mentioned that this is a consensus in the madhab. Like the Ash'ari madhab is a consensus. Okay, so this isn't something to be shy about, especially if you know what these people were saying. These people are saying that slaves can create things. Okay, the Muslim believes La ilaha illallah. The Muslim believes there is no creator except Allah. The Muslim believes Allah has no partners. These Mu'tazila are saying every human is a partner to Allah. How many people are on the earth right now? 7 billion, 8 billion? I don't know the latest count. But these people are claiming there's billions of partners for Allah. And we supposed to like be uncertain as to whether they kafirs or not? Come on, man. This is nuts. Like, it's really crazy. But despite how crazy it is, the author, may Allah have mercy on him, he knew that there were people. Remember, this author lived in our times. He only died like 15 years ago. Okay, the author, he lived in our times. He knows the mentality of the people of our times, and he knows that people will be shy and feel uncomfortable if you declare certain kinds of beliefs to be blasphemy. And so he's saying, look, he named some bigwigs to say these people said it's blasphemy, mentioned that one of those bigwigs said it was a consensus, and says, if you want more certainty, go read these books, because he's going to give more information in those books. Okay, this isn't something for us to be confused about or twisted about. He says, thus, his conveyance, meaning what Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi conveyed about the whole Ash'ari madhab being united in saying that these people are kafirs, says his conveyance is not discredited by the talk of Al-Baltimoori and his likes, who came before him or after him. Okay, there's a scholar whose name is Al-Baltimoori. Sometimes they say Al-Baltimoori. He was like a big Shaykh at Al-Azhar in his time. He lived a few centuries ago. And in the Shafi'i school, people study some of his books. MashaAllah. And in the Ash'ari school, there's a well-known text, Jawharat al-Tawheed. And Al-Baltimoori, he has a sharh, an explanation of it. This man Al-Baltimoori, or Al-Baltimoori, he's among those who says that the Mu'tazila are not kafirs. And what the author of this book is saying here is a scholar of the status of Al-Baltimoori is like nothing in comparison to a scholar of the status of Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi. It's like nothing. So he's saying, do not think that someone like Al-Baltimoori, that his statement somehow discredits the statement of Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, when Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi is like among the big imams of our ummah's history. No, he's saying, don't let this confuse you or, deceive you or even make you feel uneasy or have doubts or anything like that. In the end, just remember what these Mu'tazila are saying. They're saying that Allah has billions of partners. Okay. Some of them say that Allah is obligated to do things. What that means is they're saying Allah doesn't have a will. They're saying Allah is compelled. Okay, these people, they're going against the most basic fundamental beliefs of the Muslims. They're going against the basic and fundamental understanding of the 2 shahadas. This is not an area where we can be wishy-washy. All right. To build a house, you need a firm foundation. You can't have a wishy-washy foundation. And in Islam, the foundation is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. That's the foundation. Okay, we cannot allow somebody to come in and turn a firm foundation into something wishy-washy. No. Rather, what I've done in the past, based on what I've heard, is, I said, well, maybe he's not talking about the same Mu'tazila. Because the Mu'tazila were not all they weren't monolithic. They weren't one group. There were some who believed certain things and others who believed other things. Some of the Mu'tazila, they rejected the teaching that slaves create their actions. They rejected the teaching that Allah is obligated to do what's best for the slave. Okay? Some of the Mu'tazila rejected those things, but the reason why they're Mu'tazila is for some of the beliefs of the Mu'tazila that are less than kufr, such as the belief of the Mu'tazila that Allah will not be seen in paradise. This is a deviant belief, but it's not kufr because they have a ta'wil for that ayah. Okay, or like the belief of the Mu'tazila, like the ones who used to say the Quran is created, like the three caliphs, the ones that used to say the Quran is created, but what they meant by it is just the sounds and the letters. They weren't denying that Allah is attributed with speech. Okay, these kind of people, some of them are like that. Like they had some incorrect beliefs, but they avoided the incorrect beliefs that take you out of Islam. For Mu'tazila that meet that description, they're not kafirs because they avoided the beliefs that take you out of Islam. So I'm just telling you my own personal choice. When I hear that one of the well-known scholars says that the Mu'tazila are not kafirs, there's no way I accept that they believe that someone who says Allah has billions of partners is not a kafir. No, I figure they must be talking about, the individuals who avoided those kind of beliefs. It says, I'm going over, so I'm going to just finish this chapter real quick. As for the talk of some of the early scholars about abandoning charging them with blasphemy, okay, so here he's saying that actually among the early scholars, the ones who lived during the time when the Mu'tazila were strong, some of them also have statements suggesting the Mu'tazila are not kuffar. And so here the author is going to address that. It says, as for the talk of some of the early scholars about abandoning charging them with blasphemy, that refers to the likes of Bishr al-Marisi and al-Ma'mun al-Abbasi. So what he's saying here is back in the time when the Mu'tazila were strong, remember, they weren't all monolithic. They didn't all agree about everything. Some of them only had some of the Mu'tazila astray beliefs. And he's given an example of one, like Bishr al-Marisi. He says, Bishr agreed with them about the creation of the Quran. And he charged them with blasphemy about the creation of the deeds. So Bishr used to call the other Mu'tazila kafirs for saying that the slave creates deeds. So Bishr agreed with Ahlul Sunnah that the one who says the slave creates his deeds is a kafir. He agreed with us about that, but he disagreed with us because he said the Quran is created. Meaning he used to say that sentence. The author continues, so not everyone ascribed to the school of the Mu'tazila is judged with the same judgment. But every individual among them is judged as being misguided. Okay, so what he's saying here is each person is judged individually. Okay, we don't sit there and say everybody who identifies as Mu'tazila is a kafir. We don't do that. We go person by person. We say if this person believes that the slave creates his own deeds, that person is a kafir. If this person believes that Allah is obligated to do what's in the best interest of the slave, that person is a kafir. Okay? But if you find someone who avoided those teachings and only had, some of the less than kufr teachings of the Mu'tazila, well, then in that case, we don't judge that person to be a kafir. Okay, we're saying each person gets his judgment according to what he believes and according to what he said. But we don't say every single person who identifies as a Mu'tazilite is a kafir. And this is why some of the earlier scholars, you see statements from them that the Mu'tazila are not kafirs. They're not talking about the ones who are obviously kafirs. They're talking about the ones who are like, who avoided the clear kufr, but they still identify as Mu'tazila. How do we judge them? He's saying those are not kafirs. And similarly, when I hear about later scholars like Al-Baltimoori claiming that the Mu'tazila are not kafirs, I assume that they're talking the way those few early scholars talked, talking about the ones who avoided the obvious kufr. But, you know, people who know more than me know better what Al-Baltimoori intended. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We'll pick up next class with the start of a new chapter, insha'Allah ta'ala. If you have questions, ask them in the box. I'm going to start reviewing questions, and it looks like there's plenty of them today. Someone asked, is mut'ah allowed in Islam? That's off subject. But if by mut'ah you mean temporary marriage, then no, this is not permissible. And the one who engages in one, is if he lies with that spouse, then it's zina. Someone asked about a dua to change the qadr. Okay, the basic belief of the Muslims is that Allah is eternal and unchanging, and that his attributes are eternal and unchanging. None of Allah's attributes are subject to change. When we say qadar, okay, what we're talking about is we're either talking about taqdeer, meaning Allah's attribute by which he destined everything that will happen. Clearly, his attribute doesn't change. Or we're referring to the actual destined things. Okay, and the destined things can only play out the way that Allah willed in eternity and knew in eternity for them to play out. So since his will and knowledge don't change, the sequence of what will happen also will not change. Okay, it is not acceptable to ask Allah to change the qadr, nor to believe that it's possible for the qadr to be changed. Okay, this is something that is actually kufr and blasphemy to believe. The person cannot believe that the attributes of Allah are subject to change, because that which is subject to change is not eternal. If a person believes that Allah's will can change, then ultimately, they may not realize it, but ultimately they're saying that Allah is created. Okay, because if his attribute is subject to change, then you're saying the attribute is not necessary. And if you're saying the attribute is not necessary, then you're saying the attribute is possible. And if you're saying the attribute is possible, then you're saying it only exists because something made it exist. And if it only exists because something made it exist, you're saying it has a beginning. And if you're saying it has a beginning and you're attributing it to Allah, then you're necessarily saying Allah also has a beginning, because it's impossible for an eternal thing to have a created attribute. Okay, like that's what I mean. A person may not realize where this leads, but by believing that Allah can change, you are also believing that Allah is a creation. In fact, the greatest and clearest sign that this universe is created is the fact that it changes. Change is a definitive proof that something is created. So to believe that change is applicable to Allah is to also believe that Allah is a creation. Okay? There is no valid dua, there is no sahih dua for Allah to change his qadr. We had a whole class on this like 2 classes ago. Okay, there's no dua like that. Okay, rather, the duas that are sahih refer to something called the al-qadr al-mu'allaq. It's like the conditional decree, meaning there are certain things where Allah, the command that's written in the guarded tablet that the angels copy down, what's written there is like, if the slave makes this dua, then he gets such and such. If he doesn't, then he gets such and such. Or it says, if the slave maintains his, connections to his kin, he'll live to be this age. If he doesn't, he'll live to be that age. It's written on the guarded tablet in a way that is conditional. And the angels are looking to see, will he give this charity? Will he maintain his familial connections? Will he make this dua? Will he do that? Will he do that? The angels are watching so that they will know how they are supposed to act. Okay? But this does not mean that Allah's will is changing. No. Allah knows what the slave will do, knows when the slave will die, knows what the slave is going to get. In fact, willed for all of that before he even created angels or created the slave. Okay, so it's not the qadr that changes. What it is the angels, their tasks will be this way or that way depending on what the slave does. This is what's meant in the few hadith that are sahih that a person might interpret that way. This is why we also need to be very careful not to get our knowledge from books. Because some of the books, they translate hadith in very literal ways that mislead the reader. Okay, we want to get these things and understand the proper tafsirs of ayahs, the proper explanations of hadith that were passed down from the top scholars, not from like random people in our times. He asked another question about a specific hadith. I don't recognize the hadith he's referring to. You know, it's funny. Someone made a comment here about the Imam Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari. May Allah have mercy on him. How he was a Mu'tazilite earlier in his life, and then he became and founded the Ash'ari school later in life. I don't know if y'all ever heard the story of what caused him to do that, but it pertains to the Mu'tazilite teaching that Allah only wills good for the slave, and that Allah is obligated, in fact, to do what's best for the slave. This was a Mu'tazilite teaching. And so the young Imam al-Ash'ari, he asked his teacher, he said, can I ask you about 3 people? And the teacher said, yes. He said, I'm going to ask you about a young child, about a man, an adult man, and about a kafir. He says, the young child, Allah killed him as a young child. If and this is all in the context of this belief that Allah must do what's best for the slave. He says the child would have a valid complaint. The child will say to Allah, why did you kill me as a child? No, I'm telling it wrong. He said, I'm going to ask you about a young child, about a man and a kafir. And he started by asking about the man. He said to the teacher, who will reach higher levels of paradise? The man who lives a long life as a believer and dies, or the one who dies as a child? And the teacher said, well, the one who lived a long life and did a lot of good deeds, he'll achieve higher levels of paradise. And then the young Imam al-Ash'ari, he says, well then, if Allah is obligated to do what's best for the slave, why didn't he let the child also live a long life so he could do more good deeds and reach higher levels of paradise? The teacher said, oh, it's because Allah knew that if that child lived longer, he would die as a kafir. So Allah killed him when he was a child because that's what was better for him. And Imam al-Ash'ari said, well then, why didn't he kill the kafir as a child? That would have been better for the kafir. And with that, like the teacher was defeated. The teacher knew that the young Imam al-Ash'ari exposed the falsehood of that teaching. And after that, mashallah, he developed, he went and learned the actual aqidah that had been passed down from the Sahaba and prepared more arguments to defend it. MashaAllah. Someone asked, saying the Quran is created is not blasphemy? Saying the Quran is created can be blasphemy or it cannot be blasphemy, depending on what you mean by it. But it's always haram to say that sentence just by itself. It's always haram. Okay, if you mean by that Allah does not have an attribute of speech, then that's kufr. It's blasphemy. If you mean by that Allah has an attribute of speech which does not resemble the creation in any way, but that the revealed expression, that the sounds and letters of the revealed text are created, but rather that they're expressing something uncreated, well, then this is a true statement. But it's only permissible to say all of this in a context like the one we're in right now, a context of clarifying the aqidah so that the student understands the subtleties of our belief. It's never acceptable for you to just be walking down the street and just say to someone, the Quran is created. Even if you mean it in a way that's not against our aqidah, it's still haram for you to say it. Because it's misleading and because, like I said, it's like one of the banner sayings of an astray group. Also, I'm not saying that those three caliphs, I'm not saying it was okay for them to say this sentence. And I'm not saying it's okay because they were leaders. I'm saying it was haram for them to say this sentence and definitely haram for them to torture the Muslims for not saying this sentence. But the haram thing that they did was less than blasphemy. So they were sinful rulers. They weren't kafirs. And as Muslims, if the ruler is a Muslim, even if he's a sinful Muslim, we are forbidden from rebelling against him. Okay. However, if the caliph is an actual kafir, if he leaves Islam, we're obligated to rebel against him. You understand the difference? So the fact that those three caliphs were saying this sentence and teaching this sentence and even punishing people for not saying the sentence, the fact that the scholars of the time did not declare them to be kafirs is evidence that they did not adopt the more severe positions of the Mu'tazila, such as the belief that slaves create their own deeds. If they had adopted a position like that, the scholars of the time would have declared them kafirs, and the whole ummah would have risen up against them. I'm saying this is part of the evidence. This is part of how we know that they did not adopt the kufr teachings of the Mu'tazila. Rather, what they did is they agreed with the Mu'tazila in that one sentence. And even in that one sentence, they didn't mean the same thing the Mu'tazila meant. Someone asked to be safe and avoid blasphemy. We should say that the Quran was revealed. You don't really need to go into this in your everyday speech. Just know that Allah is attributed with speech, that the speech, which is Allah's attribute, is eternal and endless, it's unchanging, and has no similarity of any kind to the creation. Know also that a revelation was made to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a revelation that is in Arabic language, which is sounds and letters. These are similarities to the creation. Okay, sounds are similar to created sounds. Letters are similar to created letters. The Arabic language is something that created beings use. Okay, that revealed text has very clear similarities to the creation. So it's clear that the revealed text is not the attribute that Allah is attributed with. That revealed text is something else. Okay, but it's expressing something that's uncreated. It's expressing speech that Allah said with his eternal speech, which is not a sound or a letter. We don't have to go into all of this in our daily lives, though. You can just say it says in the Quran such and such. Okay, we don't need to be like all. Not every conversation has to be an Aqidah lesson. Okay, but when we want to be careful about our speech, just don't say the Quran is created. How about that? Yes, you can say the Quran is the speech of Allah by either meaning. If you say the Quran and you mean by that the attribute of Allah, the eternal attribute of Allah, then you can still call it the speech of Allah because it's Allah's attribute. And if you say Quran and you mean the revealed text, revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you can call that the speech of Allah also because it wasn't composed by any created thing and it's expressing things that Allah said with his attribute of speech. So both of these, like the revealed text and the attribute of Allah, both of these things, the attribute of Allah and the revealed text, both of these things are called Quran. Both of these things are called the speech of Allah. Okay, the words themselves are ambiguous, which is why it requires an Aqidah lesson to make clear how the words have more than one usage. And when you're using it one way, there's certain things we believe. And when we're using it the other way, there's certain things we believe. No, Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi is not the same as al-Junaid al-Baghdadi. They are not the same. Ashabuna is something that some of the scholars use. It's a term some of the scholars use to refer to other scholars who are also Shafi'i and Ash'ari. Okay, it's not something that people like you and I use. Like I don't go around saying Ashabuna, talking about Shafi'is and Ash'aris. Okay, no, this is something scholars say. We're talking about other scholars. I'm talking about big scholars. Okay, it's not something that we're going to start using in our everyday life. Somebody asked me to make sure about something, but I don't know what he wants me to make sure about. So ask at the bottom, inshallah, and when I get to it, I'll answer. Someone said that they wouldn't call a Christian a kafir. Okay, let me just be a bit more clear with my speech here. When I say call a Christian a kafir, I don't mean you walk up to their face and be like, you a kafir. That's not what I mean. I mean, in your heart, you consider them to be a kafir. When I said you call them a kafir, meaning on the inside, in your inside voice, inside your head, you recognize them as a kafir. Okay, and this is not something controversial. There's only two kinds of people. You're either a kafir or you're a Muslim. The fact that that person is not a Muslim is already enough to know that they're kafirs. Okay, you don't have to hear them say something. You don't have to hear them say Jesus is God before you consider them a kafir. Okay, if you know for certain that they're not a Muslim, that's already enough information for you to call them, for you to consider them a kafir in your heart. Whether you call them that with your mouth is a whole separate issue. Well, if Uthaymeen and Fawzan said dua changes qadr, then so what? You know, you're talking about people who believe that Allah is in a place, that Allah goes up and down, people who believe Allah has similarities to the creation. Those, you know, if they really believe those things, and they were kafirs even before they believed that dua changes qadr. So all they did is just add, if that's true, all they did is just add blasphemy on top of blasphemy. Our dua cannot change anything that's going to happen. Okay, Allah in eternity, meaning before creating the world, before creating the heavens, the earth, the space, the sky, before creating time, Allah destined everything that's going to happen. And the world is going to play out exactly according to how Allah destined it before creating the world. There's nothing we can do to change anything. Okay? We make dua because it's an act of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're rewarded for it. And if Allah willed to give us what we asked for, then we get it. If Allah did not will to give us what we asked for, then at least we did a good deed and we get reward for that. Okay, but us making the dua in the first place is already something that Allah willed. And whether we get it or are not going to get it is something that Allah willed in eternity. Making dua doesn't change any of that. Okay, it doesn't change any of that. Someone asked, where do we send donations? I'm not the one who knows that, but I'm sure someone from the Masjid Muhammad of Atlantic City network, yeah, they can put it up there for those who want to give donations, mashallah. All right. Well, that does it for me, inshallah. Barakallahu fikum. I'll see you next week, inshallah ta'ala, at the same time and place. May Allah bless you. May Allah keep you. May Allah grant you success, inshallah. Let's say La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. Barakallahu fikum. I'll see you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.